Okay, let's look at Daniel chapter 1 together. I hope that by now you have already completed the study guide. And certainly if you have not, make sure you go back, read through the chapter, and then complete the study guide as you have instructions there. But let's go and look at the chapter ourselves. And we're going to start out right at the beginning of this book with a basic fundamental question that the book of Daniel confronts us with. Now, let's get context just for a second here, and let's think about what's happening in the history of Israel. God has warned and warned and warned again to the nation of Israel that if they will not repent of their idols, if they will not turn away from their rebellion, if they will not change their ways, they will be judged. Now we've come to the end, and just in keeping with Isaiah's warnings and Jeremiah's warnings, the people have not repented. They have not turned from their sin. So the judgment has arrived. The thing that they knew was coming and were warned about over and over again, that thing has now arrived. Judgment has come to the people of God. And you can see this right at the beginning, Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He besieged it. And the city is destroyed. The people are destroyed. Look at this. The king of Judah is given into Jehoiakim's hand, along with part of the vessels of the house of God which he carried, Nebuchadnezzar carried, into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the result of this now is that God's people and God's things, the holy vessels of the temple, are now in the hands of a wicked king. Process this. Think just for a moment. Think about. Remember that story way back when they took the Ark of God and they marched around Jericho? They went around it 7 days, and then the last day the walls crumble and they all go charging in, and the city that would seem impossible to conquer is destroyed because of the power of God. Remember that time that the Philistines took the Ark of God? And the ark was carried away and it was put in the temple of their God. And the result of that is that then they had sicknesses and plagues and complete destruction of their nation, until eventually they had to return the ark of God back to Israel. And basically in those days you just see nothing can stop the power of the people of God when they're walking with God. And God is delivering all the nations of the earth into their hands. And the basic question that you would be asking then in Daniel chapter 1 is, what happened to our God? What happened to his power? What happened to the victory of Joshua and Moses and David? What happened to all of these victories in the past? And has God forgotten us? Does he not care? Does he not see? Are we left alone? In fact, actually, it gets worse. Do you remember this place in Isaiah 37? This is before the book of Daniel. And one of the kings coming up against the nation of Israel starts to mock and criticize and laugh at them. And this is the way it sounds as he makes these mocking words. Thus shall you speak to Hezekiah, let not thy God in whom thou trustest deceive thee, saying, Jerusalem shall not be given into my hand. Behold, have you not heard what we have done to all the other lands of the nations that we have overcome? Have the gods of the nations delivered them? What about Gozan and Haram and Rezeph and the children of Eden? What about their gods? Their gods did not deliver them. So how will your God deliver you? And the mocking that he's making is this basic assumption. If my people and my armies conquer your people and your armies, that means my gods are stronger than your gods. That means that my gods are more real and more powerful than yours. And the assumption then behind all of this would be that Nebuchadnezzar goes in thinking now that he has not just conquered Israel, but he has conquered Israel's God. You can see this a little bit later when you get to chapter 5. And Nebuchadnezzar's descendant, brings out all of the pieces from the temple, all of the pieces from the different countries that he has conquered, and he laughs and he parties, and the idea of it is, look, our gods have overcome all of these nations. So the question that you're asking here in Daniel chapter 1, is God going to let himself be conquered like that? Where is the powerful God of Israel? Has he been forgotten? Or has he forgotten his people? Has he no more power? What will he do? Now, that then introduces the problem of the book, or the problem of the chapter that's a little bit more specific still. And this is the difficult problem of the young men who are carried into Babylon. So let me introduce that problem to you now. If you watch what happens as the book unfolds, then you discover that these young men have been carried as captives into Babylon, and now they're faced with a terrible choice. The king has taken certain of the children of Israel, and what you could say here would be like the young people of Israel. He's chosen out young people in whom was no blemish, skillful in wisdom, cunning in knowledge, and he wants to bring them to the king's palace, and he wants to train them here so that they will be trained in the ways of the Babylonians. He wants to teach them the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans so that at the end of the time they can stand before the king. So his basic plan here is, let me bring these people in, and I will train them for my purposes. What I want you to appreciate is just how complicated their situation is. So here are quite a few reasons why these young people carried away into Babylon have good reason to compromise. First of all, recognize their age. They're probably only 14 years old. There are some reasons, and you can look in the notes to get some details about why we think that. But they're not adults. And they're very young then, very much, we could say, very impressionable people. They leave home to be educated in a new culture, new language, a new life. When we say they leave home to be re-educated in a new culture, language, and life, recognize this means they go to a new country that is more sophisticated than theirs. And Babylon at this time would be considered far more advanced, much wealthier, much more scientifically developed. And the place they just left was conquered and destroyed. So you recognize it would be like being taken to the big city. Let's say somebody grows up way in the mountains somewhere, and then suddenly they're just dropped into one of the world's capital cities. And they're looking around and, wow, this is a lot more sophisticated than where I came from. They keep on going. Their new surroundings, more advanced then, are going to tempt them to think, wait, if my God was in a simpler country, now that I'm in this more sophisticated place, maybe I should just accept their ways. Even the names are changed. Okay, if you pay attention to the meaning of the names, Daniel's name originally means God is my judge. Well, it's changed to Belshazzar, which means Bel, protect his life. Bel is a pagan god. Hananiah, his name is Yahweh is gracious. Well, his name is now changed, and the meaning of his name is command of Aku, which is the moon god. Mishael, whose name before meant who is what God is, now changed to who is what Aku is. Do you see? What his name was before, who is Israel's God, now changed to a Babylonian god. Azariah, Yahweh has helped, now becomes servant of Nebo, which is another of the Babylonian gods. In other words, you realize every time someone even calls their name, what they're hearing is a reminder, a reminder, a reminder. Our gods conquered your God. And now you are part of our country, our nation, and you must serve our gods. And keep on going. Even more reasons to compromise. You realize, in addition to these things, they're called upon to eat the king's food, and really refusing to eat the king's food is going to be viewed as resisting and probably even insulting the king. You realize this if you travel somewhere else and people offer you their very best food. I mean, this is the best food available. It's the king's food. And you turn away from that food. Is that not? Anywhere you go, that's kind of offensive. And in this case now, here they are, young men, teenagers, brought as refugees, captured, and they're supposed to become the best and the brightest in this new kingdom, but they're right at the beginning refusing and resisting the king. Everybody around them is doing it. Everyone else is eating the king's food, right? So what's your problem? We don't know exactly. I mean, we can't prove that there were other Jewish captives there, but it seems likely that there were probably other Jewish captives that just kind of went with it, just accepted it. Recognize that by resisting, they would lose chances for advancement. If you're brought to the capital city and you're being re-educated and renamed, you really need to do your best. I mean, study hard, get the best grades, try to connect yourself with the most powerful people, because you've just got to survive. And if you're going to get further in the kingdom, then you've got to find a way to succeed. Well, if now you're resisting the king from the very beginning, why would he advance you? Just practically speaking, the food is the best in the land. Okay, so I want to imagine every day they go and it's lunchtime, right? They finish their work, they go and they sit down, and there's this huge table with all of the very best food in the kingdom. And Daniel and his friends are going to go over somewhere else and eat vegetables. Okay, and you do that every day, all the time. It's the smell, right? Think of the smell. Think of you're hungry, and this is the best food that's available, and you're going to stop and not eat it. They're 900 miles away from Judah. Nobody will know what they do. Nobody. And finally, we could just recognize maybe the biggest question of all. Since God led them into captivity, does he even care? I mean, there would be a reasonable argument they could make. Well, if God really wanted us to obey his laws, maybe he should have kept us in our own country. But if God then abandons us to the Babylonians, what's the problem? If we go ahead and accept the ways of the Babylonians, who can complain? Now, one question I haven't answered that I want to make sure you understand. What's the big deal anyway? As in, why is this such a critical issue that they refuse to eat the king's meat? And that's something sometimes people assume that what we're talking about here is some kind of like nutrition sort of thing. Okay, so if you look at the original statement, you have the record here that the king apportioned for them the very best of his food. And Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's meat, nor the wine which he drank. So he goes to the king, to the king's representative, and he asks him if they will let him eat pulse and water. Okay, and pulse would be like vegetables. Some of the other translations actually translate it that way, vegetables and water. And so it's easy, or it's tempting maybe to read this and think, okay, I know about this. My doctor and my nutritionist and what I read on the internet always says I should eat less junk food, eat less meat, and I should be eating more vegetables and drinking more. So the logic goes, great, I know about healthy eating. Daniel's just trying to be healthy here. He's just following my doctor's advice. Hopefully you recognize that's not it. And I have some reasons to know that that's not it. I mean, you could see down here, verse 15, at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh. You could think, see, healthy eating, and then they look great. Okay, but pause for a second. Really? 10 days? I mean, I wish, if you've ever needed to cut off some pounds or something, it would be great if you could eat healthy food for 10 days. And your appearance could be noticeably better after 10 days. No, that's a little bit too easy. And keep on going. Look at verse 17. God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. I don't think that came from 10 days of healthy eating. What's going on here? There are two things. The basic issue here is not healthy food. The basic issue here is obedience. to God's commands. And here's where, as a person living in the church age, in the time of the church, and as a Gentile, I don't see something that would have been obvious to a Jewish reader. Remember, God had given them specific laws about what they could eat. No pork, no shellfish, and even laws about how the food should be prepared. The blood must be poured out. I mean, very specific things. Okay, to go into Babylon and eat the king's food, you're going to end up violating what God had said. You won't be keeping his laws, the dietary laws. I don't think about that as a Gentile living in the New Testament era, because that's no longer a requirement. Okay, but for Daniel, this is a basic issue of obedience. If he eats this food, he has disobeyed his God. In fact, there's a detail that's really interesting if you notice later on in the book. You'll find Daniel actually is eating fine food, and he is willing to eat and drink more of not just vegetables as in here. Okay, what's going on there? He's much older. He is now in a ruling position, and I think when you put the pieces together at that point, he can have his own cook. He can have somebody who prepares his food for him according to the requirements of the Old Testament. But here, as a 14-year-old, he has none of that right. And so the basic problem then is, if he eats the king's food, he is disobeying God's laws. In the middle of all of this, the reasons I gave you just a moment ago, Daniel could have looked at this and said, well, maybe God will forgive me. Maybe the laws don't apply the same way. His choice instead is a choice of sacrifice. He sets aside the king's best food, and instead he eats vegetables. This could include like bread, but simple food. It's a choice to sacrifice, but it's a lot more. It's a choice of faith. And here's why I say that. His initial request to the king's servant is if he would be able to eat other food. Okay? The king's servant responds to him, verse 10, I fear my lord the king, because what if at the end of this time, which probably was years, what if he should see that your faces are less healthy than others? Listen to this. You will make me endanger my head to the king. This is a matter of life and death. This is serious business. And so initially the king's servant refuses. So Daniel goes, verse 11, to a lower level servant, like a person lower down the hierarchy. And he gives here just a test. Prove thy servants. Here, give us a test. Give us a chance. Give us a chance for 10 days. Let us eat vegetables to eat. Let us drink water for 10 days. And at the end of that 10 days, bring us in and test us. And what you see, then you can make your decision. You realize Daniel has made a matter of faith. God can deliver us. God will help us. And in the middle of all of this, with all of the reasons to compromise, Daniel places his situation in the hands of God. The Lord will have to be the deliverer. The Lord will have to prove what is the solution here. The answer is that God intervened. We just saw this a second ago. There's no way that Daniel, at the end of 10 days, looks better and is healthier than all of the other people. Apart from, let's call it what it is, a miracle. Okay, but keep on going. And I want to show you one other reason that it's so much of a dramatic miracle. Watch this. Excuse me. At the end of the 10 days, God gave them knowledge and wisdom and learning. Okay, but not just that. Watch this in verse 20. In all matters of wisdom and understanding, the king found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the astrologers that were in all his realm. 10 times better. And just put context on that. These are the wise men of Babylon. These are the wisest experts. These are the PhDs and the doctors. These are the most skilled, possibly the most skilled experts in the ancient world. And the king discovers that Daniel and his friends, as teenagers, are more knowledgeable and skillful. No, not just more knowledgeable and skillful, 10 times wiser than the best experts in the entire realm in one of the most advanced kingdoms of the era. This is a miracle. You don't reach expert status by the age of 18 when you just arrived 3 years before. And you certainly don't arrive at 10 times better than everyone else. And the point of all of this is the last idea I really want us to understand. The book of Daniel, and Daniel chapter 1, is not about exalting Daniel. Okay, so I've talked already several times about Daniel's courage and his willingness, his faith to trust himself to God. And we can respect that. I mean, we can be very much touched and challenged by Daniel's purposing in his heart. We can respect the careful way that he respectfully approached the king's steward to make a request. We can appreciate his faith that God would deliver him. Okay, but the hero of Daniel chapter 1 is not Daniel. Who is the hero of Daniel chapter 1? Well, who did this miracle? Who made them 10 times wiser than all the magicians and astrologers in all the realm? And the chapter itself tells you, right here, God gave them knowledge and skill and wisdom. In multiple other ways through the chapter, and I would encourage you to read through the chapter and look for these and highlight them. Notice God intervening, God working to change the direction of this story. For instance, right here, God brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. God is the one that's directing this story. And what you discover now is that a story that seems like it is swerved completely out of control, it's not. God is the one working behind it. In fact, in the study guide, I asked you to list the different actors of the story, and if what you come up with, well, Daniel, what a great guy, and look at his 3 friends and how courageous they were, and you miss the most important detail. The most important detail and the most important character in this story is God. God is directing this story where he wants it to go. You remember at the very beginning of our time, I started out with a problem, or this crisis. Where is God? Has he forgotten us? Is God still there? Is he listening? And I argued at the very beginning of the story that a Jew might think that the power of Jehovah God, Israel's God, is lost, or somehow he is forgotten. But now I want you to notice how or why this destruction has happened. When I read this earlier, kind of stepped over these words on purpose. But how did the city or the people find themselves in this judgment? Verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. This was not an accident, as in it just sort of happened, or Nebuchadnezzar was stronger, and so, oh no, God has forgotten us. That's not it at all. God is the one who's allowing this to happen. No, God is the one who gave them into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. And why? Even in the middle of this disaster, God is still in control. God is still working. And God still has a plan. And that plan actually extends far into the future. This is the absolute marvel of Daniel chapter 1, because there's a final detail that comes at the end, and we just pass over it without thinking. Maybe we don't even notice it there. But notice the final words of Daniel chapter 1. After God has exalted them, God has blessed them, now they're actually standing as counselors to the king. You get to the end, Daniel continued even until the first year of King Cyrus. Okay, which Cyrus? What's the significance of that? What's so important about that? Well, again, if you're a careful reader of the Old Testament, coming from a Jewish perspective or just knowing the Old Testament, those words are going to stand out. The reason they're going to stand out is because the name Cyrus is hugely significant in the plans of God for his people. For instance, here's Isaiah. This is long before Daniel. Even before Cyrus is born, even before any of these things have started to happen. You read this, Isaiah chapter 45, and it says, or 44, verse 28. God says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd. He will perform all my pleasure. He's going to eventually rebuild my temple, God says. I have plans, and this Cyrus is the one who will do my plan. In chapter 45, the Lord says to Cyrus, his anointed, I'm going to accomplish all of these things through you. You, Cyrus, are my servant. You get a little further on, and this is now after the time of Daniel, but in the book of Ezra, in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah was fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, and Cyrus, king of Persia, said, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. So, verse 7, Cyrus the king brought forth the vessels of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem. And Cyrus declared and decreed, these vessels return back to Jerusalem where they belong, and the temple will be rebuilt. God's purpose and God's plan to restore his people back to the nation look all the way up ahead to Cyrus the king. What does that have to do with Daniel chapter 1? Well, this is that detail that we might read right over. Because at the end of Daniel chapter 1, you get the hint here that even in the time of destruction and conquest, when the nation has been destroyed, God is already looking ahead to the time of Cyrus and the time of the coming deliverance. Daniel chapter 1, Daniel has already been put in place so that he can already be ready to be part of God's deliverance. Daniel has been exalted. They stood before the king. And that's why these young men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, are already standing as counselors before the king. Why? Well, we're going to learn more about this as we keep on going with the book of Daniel, but we'll watch as God places them in position where far into the future, it seems that Daniel, possibly the others, are in a position even of influencing, being part of what's happening in God's plan. Daniel continued even until the first year of King Cyrus. Is God already giving us a hint that the deliverance is on the way? He's already working and he's already planning. Here are some encouragements for us as you and I think about our own lives and about the realities that we face, or sometimes some of the confusion we face as we continue in our lives. Even in the middle of disaster, even in times where everything around you looks like it has fallen apart, even when we don't see it, number one, God is still at work. Remember that God has still a plan, even if you can't see it, even if you don't know what God is doing. There is a plan. Second, in the time of confusion and in the time of disaster, keep on doing what's right. Even if you don't see his purpose, and even if you don't see exactly what you should do, don't capitulate, don't give in. Trust that God is working even when you don't see it. And finally, recognize that you may never know all the things that God is doing. In the midst of these kinds of difficult circumstances that Daniel and his friends are facing, did they ever know God's plan or God's purpose to deliver his people through Cyrus? Possibly, possibly not. Certainly as young men they didn't. And what that meant then was for decades, 30, 40 years, they had to continue on doing what was right, even when they couldn't see or couldn't understand God's plan. When you put those pieces together, then it becomes a call for you and I to trust a sovereign God who is working, whether we see it, whether we understand it or not. Keep on doing what's right, even if you don't understand God's plan.